What's at stake here is the freedoms of civil society. What's at stake here is this great American tradition that you can work with the government. You can even be subsidized by the government, but the government doesn't get to dictate how you think and how you behave. If you get subsidies on your farm because for soybeans, the government doesn't get to tell you you have to go to church on Sunday, or you have to have ideological balance among your farm workers, or anything of those kinds. It has not worked that way for decades, of whether a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House. And so the idea that the government gets to decide how institutions in civil society behave and what they believe is anathema to American freedom.
Hey folks, you know what you got to do. Hit that subscribe button so you never, ever, ever, ever miss an episode of Stay Tuned. President Michael Roth, thanks for joining the show. It's an honor and a privilege to have you.
It's great to be here.
So I'm going to start with a question that I mean seriously. You might not think it's so. It is a really difficult time to be a university president, a college president. They kind of drop like flies. I don't mean to say that in a dismissive way. You've been there a long time. So my first question is, what is your secret? And is it because you're from Brooklyn?
Well, that's not a secret. So it may be. I feel like I've got the best job in the country, and
still,
so I cling to it.
Do you still think it's the best job in the country? Or has it become more difficult? Is there something special about you and Wesleyan? Or
yes.
Okay, so what is that special sauce?
Well, the first thing is that I am who I am because I went to college at Wesleyan. I had such an important impact on me as a person. My parents didn't go to college, and I had never heard of Wesleyan before. I visited with a buddy when I was in high school, and I fell in love with the place, and it was a life-changing experience. I didn't really know many people who went to college. My parents, as friends, for the most part, didn't. Certainly wasn't anything you talked about. And yet, for me, Wesleyan was an opening of a universe of learning and of interesting people and of confusion and of creativity that really changed the way I work in the world and gave me a profession. And so I was, in many ways, a very loyal Wesleyan alum. And in other words, not. I never went back to a reunion. I didn't do any of the kind of rah-rah stuff that I now do as part of my job.
Now you have to.
And I enjoy it. When I was in California until I became president of Wesleyan, and didn't really think I'd come back to the East Coast. And I came in 2007, and we had some immediate crises. The economic crisis. We had a horrible murder on campus in my second year of a lovely, wonderful student who was brutally gunned down on campus by someone who was deemed by the courts to be criminally insane. And it was shocking and scary because he wasn't found immediately. Said he wanted to kill all the Jews of Wesleyan, and when they found some things in his car. And all of that went into my consciousness of, this isn't just a job like the jobs I had before. I had this other role, which was more, sometimes people call it pastoral. Sometimes it's a cheerleader. Sometimes it's a consoler in chief. As someone who had been a scholar, a teacher, and I liked my private time and all that, I found that obligation both awesome, in the sense of being terrifying, and incredibly meaningful. So I hear people complain how hard it is to be a college president. First of all, I'm very well paid. I think that, I work hard, but I'm very well paid. I'm at a place I love. I get to work with really bright students every semester. It's a challenge to manage hundreds of people with PhDs. Manage is probably the wrong word. Get along with
tenure. It's like is it like herding cats or harder?
So, sometimes, I don't want to give cats a bad name, but sometimes it can be a challenge. But the faculty at Wesleyan, I think, know that I am a faculty member. I mean, the way it works in academia is that if you're in the administration, it's like you stripped off your faculty jersey and put on an administrative jersey with an accountant's brim, not giving them what they want. But the fact I teach every semester, I have more students than most of my colleagues do, and so I find that very much an important feature of the work of my work, and so we get along well enough. I think part of it is we're structurally opposed. They want some things I can't give them.
Well, you're a
and I
manager.
do make those decisions.
Does being on the ground teaching give you street cred with your colleagues? Is that what it is?
It does with some. It does certainly with some students as well. And I'll have like a course I had in the fall had almost 100 students in it for Wesleyan. The average class size is well under 20. So that's I get to know a lot of students. I also do it just for selfish reasons because I love
like teaching,
being in the classroom. And I teach old books mostly. In the last 2 or 3 weeks of the semester, we do contemporary things, but most of the stuff I teach are things I've taught many times over the years. And I believe in them. I believe in that it's really important for them to read Aristotle or Aquinas or read Jane Austen, whatever it is. And I want to find a way to convince them. And when I was 26, I could convince them in a different way than I can now that I'm 68. And so it's a thrill for me, all of which is to say there are many challenges to the job, but there are challenges for all jobs. I feel I feel incredibly lucky to have the job I do.
I think you may be selling yourself a little bit short, being a little modest. And I think a lot of college presidents would have said exactly what you are saying to me now, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, even as recently as a few years ago when I interviewed Lee Bollinger on the podcast. I sense a distinctly different vibe now at a lot of schools. Do you have any advice, dare you give it, to other universities, their boards, or to people who are aspiring to or about to inhabit the position of president of a university?
It's hard to give advice because schools are so different from one another. When I became a college president at the California College of Arts and Crafts, now the California College of the Arts, in 2000, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And I went to see another president, and the president of the Getty, where I had worked before, Barry Munitz. And I asked him, what do you do with this board? I never had a board at the Getty. I wasn't high enough in the hierarchy to interact with the board. And he leaned in and said, let me tell you, my son, the secret, what you must do at the board. I'm not sure I'm allowed to curse on your podcast.
You can. Go ahead. My dad doesn't like it, but
whatever the fuck they want is what you do, because they can fire you. And your job, first of all, is to build a board you want, and then to get them to support the work of the university that you're leading. And I thought that was really good advice. I told the faculty in my first year, if I ever tell you that I'd like to do something, but the board won't let me, check and see if you have your wallet. Because the way it should work is the board should support what I say I want to do. And if not, they should fire me. And there's been a little bit of a running joke at Wesleyan that I threatened to quit too often.
Yeah, I read that.
But that's because there was a chair of the board for several years, Josh Boger, who was he's an entrepreneur himself. He founded Vertex Pharmaceuticals when it was a tiny little company. And so people say he thought of a board as a kind of inconvenience, as a lot of, entrepreneurs, founders do. But he said to me when I asked him to be chair of the Wesleyan board, that's it. I either support you or I fire you. I don't want to meddle. I don't want to tell you what to do. And I think it served our university extremely well. We've made some difficult moves. I've made some challenging decisions. I got rid of all male fraternities. I canceled hundreds of millions of dollars of projects in my second year that had been planned for the previous 12 years because I didn't think it was fiscally responsible. And I changed the way we do really all our fundraising and our budgeting. And And I was able to do that because the board said, well, we don't want to fire him, so we have to support him. And when I had questions about how to work with China, there was someone on the board I could talk to. If I had questions about our relationship with the government, there was someone else on the board I could talk to. So I got enormously important advice from people, but great support. And so my advice to new presidents would be same ones, the advice I got from Barry Munitz all those years ago, is that build a board that you love and that loves you. I mean, it's really important to build a board that you can work with and that you're aligned with. And I'm very fortunate at Wesleyan that the board of trustees, which is like 33 people, so it's a big group, they often have spirited discussions with me about various topics. But at the end of the day, when we decide to do something, we're going to pull in the same direction.
You get in line. Is that what you're saying?
They get in line, having aired their points of view and understanding the direction of the school. It's very important for me that they understand our strategy and how we're implementing it. So these days, I write to them every week and send them things that I'm doing in the press or tell them what's things that are happening on campus. And when I need advice, I can call anybody on the board and they make time, whether they're running a huge company and they're traveling around the world or they're in a small not-for-profit in the inner city, they make time to be helpful. So I think that after all these years, I know the board very well and they know me well. And I think that serves the university in its strategic operations. The day-to-day stuff, board members really shouldn't be involved with. And if you're at a college or university where the board is involved in specific conversations about a department or about housing issues, I mean, that's dysfunctional in my view.
I want to spend some time in a moment talking about what's going on in some college campuses and the attacks, there's no other thing to call it, by the sitting president of the United States. But I want to take a step back and ask you about the premise of college. Who should go to college? I have asked this question, or a version of it, of anyone like you, educators and others, based on my conversations over the years with Michael Sandel, who was my professor at Harvard, who in one of his most recent books talks about how in America we valorize or over-valorize college. So who should go and why? And do you agree with the assessment that maybe we make a little too much about college when 2/3 of Americans won't go?
Yeah, I hesitate to disagree with Michael Sandel because he's so smart, but no one in the industrialized world has ever faulted Americans for being overeducated. So I don't think that we have too many people going to college or that Americans have too much education that is broad and teaches them how to think and how to make their own decisions, and that we should focus more on, and then fill in the blank, focus more on what? The jobs of the future that won't require education.
Well, we're going to have AI. We don't need it.
Yeah. So I think you could have a kind of education that teaches people how to enjoy a beer and television, and that's the goal, is to be complacent and kind of half high most of the time. Or you can have an education that teaches you how to think for yourself in the company of other people and enjoy the process of learning about yourself and the world. That can happen without college, that's for sure. I mean, it could happen in high schools. It doesn't happen often enough. It happens sometimes, and especially in the schools that have appropriate resources. But I think that the idea that people, the good idea, the democratic idea in that question, who should go to college, is that people who don't go to college should not be penalized. I mean, that's the good idea there. And I think Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania and other governors in other states, and red states too, have made this decision not to require a college degree for jobs that really have nothing to do with a college education. And there's a democratic impulse there to not punish people for not going on to college. On the other side is I think it's really important that we increase access to college. That is, we increase access for people so that they can learn about themselves and the world with teachers who have deep knowledge about their subjects. And that can happen in community colleges. It can happen in four-year schools. It can happen in apprenticeship programs. I mean, I don't want to say that the only way it can happen is in a four-year school. That's certainly not the case. But I do worry about people, especially people at like Harvard, like Professor Sandel, who, when they say that not everybody should go to college, they probably don't mean their own grandchildren. I assume what they mean is then you shouldn't be penalized for not going.
Yeah, I think that is.
But it should be an opportunity for people.
Well, he makes another point that I think jibes with a point that you made that's related, and it's the way we talk about college, and it's I think in line with what you just said. I mean, you said once, I do think it would not be unfair to say we've bred a kind of condescension. You're saying this about the quote unquote fancy places. When you define the quality of your institution by how many people you reject, you can create unintentionally an attitude of I've earned my superiority. I don't know that people object to or begrudge anyone a college education, but they don't like to be talked down to. What do we do about that?
Yeah.
Is that a problem?
It is a problem. It is a problem. And I think it does come from this focus on selectivity and the numbers of people you reject, which is, not just colleges. It's all kinds of organizations in this country that
it's graduate schools too.
And also clubs of different kinds that we admire, get through a very hard filter. I mean, we don't like elitists, but we like some elites, right? I mean, if you're a Navy SEAL, we think, wow, you must be really good at these things. And it was really hard to become a Navy SEAL. If you're an elite wide receiver for a great football team, we don't say, oh, you don't deserve it. We think, no, you've got extraordinary talents. And so I think one of the complaints about colleges and universities is that they create an elite in unfair ways, and that they teach people who have not really earned their privileges in the same way a Navy SEAL does or a wide receiver does. They haven't earned their privileges. They've acquired them in a variety of ways, and I think that is unfair. And I think that there has been a backlash against those institutions. One of the things you can do about it is to focus for our schools, to focus less on how much more can we do for each individual student, how much more can we spend on each of the happy few who get into our school, and instead think, how many more people can we educate? How many more people can we open the doors of learning to? And and some of the schools have done that. I mean, in modest ways, the Ivies have increased enrollment. We've increased enrollments in small ways. But a lot of the most distinguished schools in the country really do pride themselves on how much they spend per student, well in excess of even what they charge, well in excess of $100,000 per student. And instead, I think that it would be great to see groups of community colleges that are sponsored by the wealthy universities that would educate more and more people with high quality instruction. I'll tell you, if I may, one story in this regard. We work with a great group called the National Educational Equity Foundation, and they've come up with this model where we offer credit-bearing college courses in high-poverty high schools, Title I high schools. So there's a teacher in the class to have videos from the professor at Wesleyan or at Stanford or wherever. And the kids work with the professor on tape, with TAs from the school virtually, and with a high school teacher who's in the classroom with them. And if they're successful at the same exams that are taken at the university, they get a college credit, which they can then apply if they go on to college. They also learn that if they go to one of these schools, if they get in, it's probably going to be free because they're from a Title I high school. And then most of them had never imagined that the school they hear costs $100,000 a year. For them, it would be free, completely free. And so this foundation, National Educational Equity Foundation, they aim to educate 1 million students in just a few more years. We've had thousands of students take these classes. Now, what's wonderful about that is we think they're great classes. They're Wesleyan classes. They're hard to get into, right? And then we open them up to anybody in these Title I schools who the foundation picks out. And we expand our educational offerings, and we find talented people who hadn't had the opportunity to show their talents. I think that's what you want. You want an educational system that gives talented people the opportunity to develop their talents regardless of their background.
Would you agree with the observation, speaking about your school, not all the schools that are elite, that the faculty and the student body is well left of center?
Yes.
Why is that? And so it's a question about your school. I'm sorry, it's a question about your school because that's where you're the president. But you could ask the question about, any number of elite colleges, and I've never heard an explanation that made sense to me as to why that is.
Well, I think that there's the old saw that if you're not a socialist at 20, you
right.
have no heart, and if you're still a socialist at 30, you have no brains, or something like that.
Right. Yes.
So part of it is for a long time, young people are more interested in changing things than older people.
Right. That doesn't explain the faculty. That
explains the student.
Right.
That explains the student side of things a little bit, although what it doesn't explain is it has gotten the tilt to the left has gotten greater over the last 20 years or so, maybe even more than that. And when a conservative friend who became a trustee here asked me this question some years ago, I said, "Do you know any libertarians who would spend 12 years in graduate school to get a PhD and then take a job that paid $73,000 a year?" And he said that my libertarian friends are too smart to do that. He said, I can't think of any. And so I think that that part of the tilt to the left has been that educated people are more open to change, are more open to, at least traditionally, have been more open to change, and that they tend to skew a little bit to the left. In recent years, I think this has become a vicious circle. In other words, I think that colleagues in the humanities and interpretive social sciences, especially, when they choose successful job candidates, they're choosing someone who reminds them of themselves. And so you have a situation where the English professor or the anthropology professor or the history professor says, "I'm choosing the best person, and their politics are a lot like mine." and they don't seem to take into account that when you think of the team as a whole in the history department or anthropology department, you have really narrowed the possibilities for students. That is, the students see that all the people in your discipline skew left of center or quite far to the left of center. And the people who take the classes for them like those classes, like to get that message, or they realize that in order to get a good grade, you tell the professor what they want to hear. And that happens all the time, despite professors protest. "Oh, I don't want to hear this myself confirmed." They do. And I think it's a real problem. And I think that conservatives are right to criticize higher education, especially in these fields, for not being aware of the biases that we bring to the hiring process and to the admissions process. So I was shocked because I was naive about this issue until maybe a decade ago. I was shocked when a guidance counselor told me in a public event that it would be professional malpractice for him, the guidance counselor, to tell a high school senior when asked, "What is your civic engagement like as you're applying to college?" They want to show you're a good civic person. It would be professional malpractice for the guidance counselor to tell the high school student to put down right to life protests. He said, "We all know."
That's terrible.
It's terrible. Exactly. It's terrible. And he said, "Yeah, it's terrible, but that's the world you've created." So I think that this criticism is perfectly legitimate. And I wrote a piece 2017 in the Wall Street Journal, which they gave the title "The Opening of the Liberal Mind." I called for an affirmative action program for conservatives. Everyone hated this op-ed.
I didn't hate it. I read it in preparation
Oh, you
for
did?
this
All right,
interview,
well,
sir, and I thought it had a lot of good points.
I knew I was like kind of stepping on the toes of my progressive colleagues, and I have been doing that for the last 8 years. It has begun to change. We have now other colleagues who recognize this as a problem in their hiring practices: discrimination against religious people, discrimination against libertarians, against traditional conservatives. Somebody's going to say, "Oh, you want us to hire a Nazi?" Of course, I don't. The idea that the choices between the narrow group on the left and a narrow group on the right is a false choice. But I think that academia, in these fields especially, has a lot of work to do. But it's not a conspiracy. I think it is a situation of implicit bias that we can correct by talking about it and raising the issue on campuses. The Trump administration's attempt to correct it by imposing so-called independent auditors on universities who will measure viewpoint diversity seems to me a disaster as a response to this.
I agree with
because
that.
they can't manage that. They don't know how to do that. And just one last point: there are some fields that are skewed ideologically in ways that raise similar questions. For example, if you look at pediatricians in the United States, they're much further to the left than orthopedists. So does that mean there's a problem that you want to get more like people like that is it Musk, who says empathy is the suicidal impulse of the Western civilization? You want those people as pediatricians? No. Yeah, I don't think that's the idea.
This is exactly the point that I wanted to pursue about the causation and the origins of all this. I'm guessing it's not the case that even with years of or generations of, if you think it's been that long, of this bias being in place, that a university like Wesleyan or Harvard or any of the others gets 10 qualified PhD applicants to the history program, and 5 are classic conservatives and 5 are classic liberals, and they only accept the liberals. I'm guessing the applications are skewed. And there are other professions, you mentioned pediatricians, and I was just thinking as you were speaking that from my background in law enforcement, it is widely understood that police officers, FBI agents, and others, notwithstanding some BS that people try to feed you about Hillary Clinton and other things, and the military, overwhelmingly conservative compared to the liberal members of those professions. I don't know that we say, hey, that's bad, that's terrible, that's wrong. There's no affirmative action program for liberals in the Navy or in the Air Force, and I'm not sure that there should be. Can it just be the case that certain endeavors are naturally the ambitions of people who have one point of view versus another? And is that okay?
It certainly can be. And I think so for the case of pediatricians, I think that's a great explanation. And I wouldn't want to muck with the system of who becomes a pediatrician. That the kind of personality traits that go into that choice may overlap more with the ideological proclivities of liberals than they do with conservatives. But on the other hand, I think if you're teaching in a history department and you want to give students a array of approaches to understanding the past, then being aware of ideological filters can be very important in the hiring process. So when I said to my faculty initially that I wanted to have this conversation about intellectual diversity on campus, I was told, "Oh, listen, we're not biased. We only hire the best, and the best people who are drawn to anthropology or history are people like us." And I told them that sounded exactly like those old white farts who at Princeton, when I was a student there, who were excellent historians. And we said, "Why don't you ever hire women?" And they said, "Well, we hired Natalie Davis, and that we're done." Like they said, "We only hire the best." I said, but they weren't just hiring the best. Their view of what the best was
very skewed, yeah.
Excluded some people. So, I think that if I believe that if the historians or the English department professors are aware of this, if they think twice or 3 times about it, then will probably move organically into a more balanced situation if those applicants are there. Recent study I saw in the Chronicle of Higher Education said that the applications for these jobs are skewing even more to the left, which speaks to what you were saying, Preet, that they just are attracting people of a certain ideological disposition. In the sciences, I think it's different. They still maybe left of center.
I think it's a lot less. It's according to the studies that I've seen, particularly when you get to physics, which is ironic insofar as the administration going after what they see as woke or PC run amok at universities. Where are they trying to hurt the universities? In their science departments, and with respect to medical experiments, where this issue, to the extent there is one, of lack of ideological diversity is much, much less pronounced. So that's unfortunate. I want to ask you a question about whether or not we need other universities for balance, as opposed to, or in addition to, having more balance within a university. So I had Neil Ferguson, who's not shy, on the podcast a few weeks ago, who, for understandable reasons, touted the University of Austin, which is sort of a different kind of breed. Do you have a view?
Yes.
Are you familiar with that university? Do you have a view of it? Do you think it's needed?
I don't know if it's needed. I guess it has attracted some. I mean, I hear the market speaks. That has attracted some students, and I don't know if Professor Ferguson has given up his tenured position at Stanford. But
yeah, well, he's at the Hoover Institution. I said so. He draws it. He draws a proud distinction. But I'll let him.
I see. Yeah. The faculty at the University of Austin is, I don't know if it's balanced, but it's certainly a different kind of faculty than you have at other places. And I'm not sure what they're doing about quantum mechanics and molecular biology. It seems to be, they don't talk about that very much. Most students at universities like Stanford or Wesleyan, more so at Stanford and the Ivies than at Wesleyan, they don't study English and even history. I mean, Stanford has a hard time getting anybody to major in history. And they have an incredibly good history department, great resources. But the students are not like ideologically running amok with crazy woke ideas. They're trying to start businesses before they graduate. They're majoring in economics and computer science.
They're going into finance. Large percentages of the elite university graduates are going into finance, which people decry for different reasons, right? They say, well, they should be helping the world, right?
So if there's a problem of indoctrination, what the heck? These guys want to go to Wall. They're trying to go to Wall Street. Now, Wesleyan, of course, we have a contingent of people doing that as well, and I love to visit them and ask them for money a few years after they graduate. But our students, in addition to wanting to go on in finance, are going on in education. They're going on in the arts and entertainment. And I think that's what you want at a university, I think, is a place where you don't just have to choose one thing and stick with it. There's a virtue to that, which is you can go quite deeply into that subject. But I think one of the great things about being an undergraduate is being able to explore art history and economics, or comparative religion and mathematics. And to the extent that you start a university to just give conservative views or alternative views, it will probably over time get more and more distorted. That doesn't have to be the case. I mean, as I understand, the University of Austin does want to have a great books program, and like St. John's and some other places. And I think it's very interesting for places like Wesleyan to interact with such schools. And we're hoping to create a network and a democracy project, actually, where we're interacting with some of these new places, and like the Hamilton Institutes that have been created in Florida by Governor DeSantis. I mean, these are meant to be places of conservative alternative history. And, when I've looked at them, they're serious historians. They're doing serious work. So
it's all good. It's a good thing.
It's good. Yeah. Okay. So I want to have the connections to them, so our students get exposed to their ideas and they can be exposed to our students.
I want to talk about the issue of neutrality. We talked about the premise of a university, and then sort of want to talk about the purpose of a university. And I want to read you a quote that's yours, and then a quote from something from 57 years ago in something called the Calvin Report that I know you've talked about and have considered. You said recently in an interview, I think the infatuation with institutional neutrality is making cowardice into a policy. I guess that's a provocative way of putting it. Sure. I have friends who don't believe that. I'm friends with presidents who genuinely think they're encouraging free speech by hiding. So that's one point of view, and it makes sense on its face when you read it. Much like the opening statement makes a lot of sense in a courtroom, and then the from the one side and the other side, you're like, oh, that also makes a lot of sense. Harry Calvin out of the University of Chicago, I guess, produced this report about university neutrality, and the report, among other things, says this. A university, if it is to be true to its faith and intellectual inquiry, must embrace, be hospitable to, and encouraging the widest diversity of views within its own community, is a community, but only for the limited, albeit great purposes of teaching and research. And then this is the point that I find hard to disagree with, as I find your statement also hard to disagree with. And that is, quote, the university is the home and sponsor of critics. It is not itself the critic. Can you square your view and that view?
Sure. I think the reason Professor Calvin came up with that report in 1967 is because the world was in turmoil.
Yeah.
And
unlike now.
Yeah. And that's why we have it now, right?
Right.
It's the same issue that you could get your head blown off by saying something quite reasonable because there are unreasonable people on your left and unreasonable people on your right, and unreasonable people, but who you can't just afford to not pay attention to. And so in 1967, this of course was about the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, and that report is taken to be a principle that would make the leadership of the university hold its tongue rather than to participate in public debates or debates on campus. And I think that last part doesn't follow. In other words, the university should be a sponsor for all these things, and the university leaders should play a role to help sponsor those discussions in whatever role however that might work. In other words, sometimes the university president can help a conversation along by not participating in it, by holding his tongue. And in my case, let's say, I'll give you an example. A group of Black students came to see me some years ago because there was an affirmative action bake sale in the dining room, and they were selling, if you were Black, you paid a nickel for a cupcake, but if you're white, you had to pay 25 cents. And the students came to me and said, this is racist. I said, yeah, it's racist. And they said, this is unfair. It's unfair. They said, we want you to stop them from doing this. I said, I can't do that. They have every right to say what they want, even in the lunchroom. You don't have to go over to them. But if you think it's racist, tell them and explain why. And they would explain to you why they think affirmative action is racism itself. And they said, but you just said you don't agree with them. We want you to stop them from speaking, or at least say publicly you don't agree with them. And I said, no, I first of all, they're doing a political theater. They're making a point. You could do political theater. But I, as the president, if I disagree with them in public, it's like hitting them with a hammer. And it's just not the right thing to do. I shouldn't speak out on that issue. When the Supreme Court actually overturned affirmative action, I did think I should speak out, not the views of the university, but of the president of the university. And in our case, we're taking the action shortly thereafter of abolishing legacy admission, which was, the policy of you got in more easily because of the group you belong to. And the Supreme Court said you shouldn't get into the university because you belong to the Black group or the Hispanic group. And I thought you shouldn't get in just because you belong to the alumni group. There, it seemed to me the president should speak out. In the first instance, the president shouldn't speak out because the students should work that out among themselves. Sometimes it's the faculty. The partisans of the Calvin principles, so-called Calvin principles, it's like a 4-page report, as you know, it's a brief report. They say that we don't want to speak out on everything. I agree with that. And no one has ever spoken out on everything.
So how do you decide which things to speak out on and which things
you
not?
Use your judgment, just like you do. Who do you invite to the podcast? You invite brilliant people like me, and you invite some schmo next week, right, to balance it out. But you decide. No. You make it. You know what I mean? You use your judgment. And I think What the neutrality principle does, it says you don't have to use your judgment. Because if you use your judgment, you have to defend your judgment. If you have to defend your judgment, you're in a conversation. I actually think that fosters conversation. That is, it fosters, sometimes it's debate, sometimes it's conversation, sometimes it's inquiry. And so I think that the reason this came out in 67 was to avoid those conflicts. The reason it came out again after October 7th or January, I guess, of 24, in a big way again, was because presidents found themselves in this, what they thought was an impossible position. If they spoke out and against the terrorist attacks against Israelis, their pro-Palestinian students would be up in arms. If they defended their pro-Palestinian students or criticized the extraordinarily brutal war in Gaza, then their donors or other Jewish alumni will be angry with them. So, and both sides are saying, you've got to say something. And then they have a principle that says, no, I don't. In fact, I'm actually better not speaking. You're not better not speaking. You're just afraid to annoy someone.
But who's they? Look, I have mixed feelings about both propositions personally. But if you have a university with scores and scores of really smart people who have access to the public square in a very serious way, they can all speak and say whatever, either as individuals or as members of their departments. Why do they need Michael Roth to speak?
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't. I mean, I don't speak out on tariffs. I don't speak out on tax rates. I mean, a gazillion things I add no value. I speak out when I think I have something to say that other people might find interesting to react to, or I speak out on some horrible thing that happened in the world to display concern. And I realize that second one is problematic because I can't display concern about everything, and I think I'm just like every other human being. In other words, I can speak out when I think my participation in a public conversation will be useful. And I think most of the time it's not. I have nothing particularly useful to say. These days I'm doing podcasts like this and I'm writing a lot of op-eds because I think the Trump administration is hell-bent on destroying the freedom of universities as part of its path. It destroys the freedoms of civil society. And I think people like me who have access to platforms like yours should speak out to stop authoritarianism. Now, it's true, there's an economics professor here who agrees with me, and there's a biology professor who agrees with me. And they could speak. I encourage them to speak out. But when the president of the university speaks out, that person gets a little bit more attention. Or sometimes it's because the president can say it in perhaps a more powerful way. It's not true for all presidents. Some presidents have nothing to say, apparently.
Who are those? Who are those people?
They're bureaucrats, and they're there to raise money and to approve whatever's passed by the faculty and the board. I think that that's and many schools seem to want those kind of presidents right now. And that's why it'll be very easy for a strong government actors to roll over schools that don't stand up for themselves. And I think standing up for yourself means that the president should defend the values of the institution that have been claimed as the guiding values of the school for many years. So I don't think there's no principle that you must speak, and there shouldn't be one that you shouldn't speak. It's a question of judgment. I mean, Harvard is the great example. And I joked in the fall in an interview that they passed this, not exactly neutrality, not exactly silence, and I said they were pricing in a Trump victory because they were basically giving themselves the opportunity to not get in the way of policies that they would actually oppose if they read their own mission statement. But they didn't want to do that because it would get them in hot water with the Trump administration.
How'd that work out?
What they've discovered, thank goodness that they've discovered this, and I am grateful to the Harvard leadership for doing this, what they discovered is the Trump administration is insatiable in this regard. They want control of what Harvard does. And so Harvard had to speak out and stand against this administration. And Professor Calvin said that would happen. If your mission is attacked, you have to speak out, he said. And his son, Jamie Calvin, wrote an op-ed in the Chicago Tribune 2 months ago, I think, about how his father would look at the events today. It wouldn't be to keep silent when your university core mission is threatened by a would-be dictator.
Can I ask you to talk further about that? If you're an average American, some members of your family may have gone to college, some not. Why should you give a damn about this wealthy, privileged institution called Harvard up in Cambridge that has billions of dollars in an endowment? Why does any of this business between Trump and Harvard matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. It gives me such pain to defend Harvard. Actually, I got rejected there, and I'm like the people you just described.
It's an error that they regret. I'm sure.
I don't know about that, but I'm grateful that I wound up where I have been. But it's easy to be skeptical about the world's richest and by many measures greatest university. What's at stake here is the freedoms of civil society. What's at stake here is this great American tradition that you can work with the government. You can even be subsidized by the government, but the government doesn't get to dictate how you think and how you behave. If you get subsidies on your farm because for soybeans, the government doesn't get to tell you you have to go to church on Sunday or you have to have ideological balance among your farm workers or anything of those kinds. It has not worked that way for decades of whether a Republican in the White House or a Democrat in the White House. And so the idea that the government gets to decide how institutions in civil society behave and what they believe is anathema to American freedom. I mean, American freedom has always been based in decentralization. That you get to go to the church you want or the synagogue or mosque you want, and the government, even if they're not for profits and they have tax exempt status, they don't tell you how to preach, they don't tell you how to pray, and you don't want the government telling people who are doing cancer research how to do cancer research. Because these guys can't even figure out how to use Signal. I mean, they don't know how to do it. It's like I wouldn't tell my molecular biology people how to teach molecular biology. They know what they're doing. The fact that I pay their salaries doesn't it would be so dumb of me to tell them how molecular biology should be taught and or who they should hire. Now, there are some basic parameters on the margins that people have to satisfy in order to get government funding. And that's always been the case. But what the Trump administration is doing now is trying to get ideological coordination. Like, I want my board of trustees to line up behind me, but they could fire me if they don't want to line up behind me. But what the government's telling these schools these days is, we're going to tell you how to line up. And that is really counterproductive. Our industry, our healthcare, our culture has benefited from the relative autonomy of these institutions. And so the average American benefits because you have a phone that the technology of which was first generated in a university, or you get a vaccine, the basic science of which was first done in a university. Companies can't take on that basic scientific research because they need to show profits in a shorter time frame. Universities, America had figured this out in the wake of the Second World War. Universities can engage in long-term research, the benefits of which remain unclear, but there will be benefits, we've learned. And we see that because of the supremacy of American technology and science and the contributions to world health and culture that the universities, through their subsidies from the taxpayers, have enabled. And so the average person should be concerned because it's an assault on freedom, and it'll be an assault on our prosperity and our health.
So you don't think that this is all about anti-Semitism at Harvard?
The Times anointed...
I got the biggest laugh of the interview.
Well, the Times anointed Gruber, Roth, and Garber as the three presidents resisting the Trump administration. I joked that it's like a orthodontist office, It's like three Jewish doctors. I mean...
Parents must be so proud.
I was doing an interview with a Jewish group, and they said, so I said, don't make light of anti-Semitism. And I don't mean to. I mean, I know there have been terrible anti-Semitic incidents all over the country, and including on the Harvard campus or the Columbia campus. And I think it's really important to deal with them. And I'm sure that President Garber and President Eisgruber think that too. And I think that that's work that needs to go on. The Obama administration said to schools, I think in the first 4 years, if you don't clean up your act around sexual assault on campus, you could lose all your funding. And then they engaged in this long-term negotiation and pressure to change the way sexual assault hearings happen on campus. Some of that was good, in my view, some of it not so good. But it was a back and forth over years. It wasn't like we're going to cut $1 billion and then without any investigation or any discussion. So what's going on here has nothing to do with protecting Jews. It has everything to do with ideological control. And I feel embarrassed that my Jewish colleagues, friends, brethren are supporting a president because he seems to have our backs now, while at the same time flirting with right-wing anti-Semites all day long, or Christian nationalists throughout the weeks and months. I think the best way to protect Jews and others is by the rule of law and civil rights. It's not by authoritarianism, because the authoritarian who's your friend today and it could turn on you tomorrow. It's the law that's going to protect you. It's the civil rights statutes that are going to protect us. And the fact that you can attack trans athletes, all 12 of them, and all these people will cheer. But when you get done, who are you going to attack next? We should care about trans athletes. We should care about anti-Semitism. We should care about the attacks on Muslims. But we should not let this anti-Semitism be a cover for increased executive branch power.
Are universities and their presidents and their boards in solidarity with each other on this? In my world, there's much commentary on how there was a failure of collective action on the part of law firms in the face of a similar kind of attempted domination by the president, and it's ongoing. Are you guys all together? Are you a team?
Well, it's a strength and weakness of American higher education. Is there's so many different kinds of schools. At Wesleyan, we think, we're not as rich as Williams, and at Williams, we're not as rich as Harvard. But 90% of the schools don't have the resources that we have. Some of them are community colleges, some of them are public institutions. And so they're so different. Some are, 50,000 people, some are 1,500 people or less. And so that variety makes it hard to be on the same team. However, I'm really heartened by this recent statement organized by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AAC&U, that have now several hundred presidents. I've been working on getting people to sign in a statement like that for the last month. And I think once the AAC&U got involved, and along with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, they really generated a great deal of enthusiasm among many presidents. I think there was a lot of fear. I mean, I know there was a lot of fear because I asked so many people. I asked more than 100 presidents to sign something, and a lot of people said, "I'd like to sign." It was a very moderate statement, but they were afraid their boards would be mad, the government might get mad. But I think what AAC&U has done is they've created momentum so that you want to be on that list. You don't want to be missing from the list. If you're missing from the list, like the Dartmouth is, the president has to go make a statement to the campus why I didn't sign. And, she's a very smart person, and I read that with interest. But I think that dynamic has shifted towards more solidarity. It certainly helped a lot that Harvard came out while they were organizing the statement and said that it would resist, and having Harvard out in front, so to speak, is a good thing.
Guns blazing in court. So on that note, thanks for your thoughtfulness on the program. Really a delight and an honor to have you. Thanks so much.
It was really a pleasure to be with you.